Hey folks, PCoutcast here, back with a little bit more of 6 days of snow. Picking up right where we left off, Riku was as good as her word. She returned to my room momentarily, the green tea and rice porridge on a tray. They were both piping hot. She did not linger, though I would have liked to converse with her further. That would have been improper. A woman should not tarry for so long in a man's private quarters, though Riku was not a woman, really, so much as a girl. Riku's kimono flattened out her figure, making it nigh impossible to tell whether she had curves or not, but her age was apparent by the tone of her voice and the softness of her skin. Not that such details improved the situation. If anything, it made them worse. A woman in a man's room at night is improper enough, but a teenage girl? That is truly a source of scandal. Scandal in the eyes of the newspapers, but a sensationalist romance if transmuted by the hand of an author? It all depends on how you frame things. In any case, Riku departed with that now familiar tap-tap-tap of her wooden sandals against the tatami mats, and I was left alone. The green tea was delicious. The leaves brewed perfectly, and the rice porridge was thick and nourishing. I enjoyed the food a good deal, though not as much as Sachiko's. Sachiko knows exactly how I prefer my tea, and she can steep the leaves in perfect accordance to my preferences, down to the last millisecond. Of course, Sachiko's tea would be superior, but I'd been married to her for more than 20 years. Didn't that drop? It was 25 years, now it's a little more than 20 years. Is he slowly forgetting his wife? It is a most curious phenomenon, however, that men accustomed to perfection will begin to tire of it. Is there anything more selfish than a man who cannot be satisfied? Sometimes I have to wonder. It was still snowing outside. I could see the snow in the air falling thick and fast beyond my window. The sight of it made me feel warmer than perhaps I was, for the room was cold and seemed to bleed heat from the tatami mats. Fortunately, the kotatsu helped. I think, is a kotatsu like it's a blanket? I'm not sure. Warmed both inside and out and tired from my journey, I turned in for the night half an hour later. I think I might have dreamt of Riku. The second day. I guess that probably would have been a good place to stop the last video, but anyway. The next morning dawned in understated shades of gray and blue and powder blue, and there was a pervading chill in the air. I lay in my futon for a few minutes, like a baby, eyes shut, trying to fend off the cold to little avail. The cool air brushed aside my blankets with ease, trailing ice against each and every bump of my spine. I was thankful when, a little after 7:30, Riku came to deliver my breakfast. Like yesterday, however, she didn't stay for long. That would have been, as I already explained, improper. However, maybe it was my ingrained desire as a writer to rootle? I've never seen that word before. Out stories from every nook and cranny, but I thought there might be a bit more to it than that. Riku seemed harried. Her greeting was awfully clipped compared to her congenial tones the day before. It made me wonder, and I continued to wonder while I ate my breakfast, which consisted of white rice and sauri. Sorry? Maybe Riku was being overworked? I wouldn't put it past Miss Kakiuchi. Sorry, I'm recording this really late, so my pronunciation of Japanese is going to be even worse than it was in the last episode. Though I knew little about the woman, and it seemed unfair to judge her character based on Yosuke's observations, the way she had shouted at Riku, or for Riku yesterday, did not bode well. My mother had certainly never spoken to me like that when I was a child. Sachiko, meanwhile, would have sooner eaten a bar of soap than scold Kenta or Kenji, our little boys, who weren't so little now, come to think of it. Kenta was 22. Kenji was 17, practically an adult. But children never stop being children to their parents, even when they have children of their own, and debts, and their hair stretched to thin. That's just how parents are. What of Miss Kakeuchi, though? What of Riku? It was not too unusual, I suppose, for a daughter to help her mother with a family business, particularly a business that was secreted away in the mountains and might struggle to maintain a regular staff, but interacting with your mother not only as a parent, but an employer, must have placed some undue strain on their relationship, and it was obvious it was strained. That had been more than apparent, judging by the way Riku shied away from her mother. These idle thoughts kept me busy throughout breakfast. I suppose the sauri was delicious, the skin lightly crispy, flavored with just a pinch of salt, but I hardly tasted it. This time it wasn't because I was comparing the quality of the cooking to Sachiko's. To be perfectly honest, I wasn't thinking about Sachiko at all. I finished my breakfast, leaving only the skeleton of the sauri behind. Its rib cage was snowy white, and the slender bones curved to a gentle arch. Is it some kind of fish, I guess? Wish they had pictures. With a full stomach and nothing else to do, I glanced vacantly out of the window. I thought something sounded strange when I awoke, but it was only now, well-fed and well-rested, that I realized what it was. It was no longer snowing. I'd grown so accustomed to the sound of the falling snow, the lack of it was disconcerting. It's hard to put it into words, but I suppose it was like hearing an old song, a childhood favorite, played one note out of tune. The ground was thick and heavy with snow, like a blanket. The trees that lined the inn were naked husks stripped of leaves. Their branches were laden with snow, their trunks writhed with frost. Branches looked like long, slender fingers reaching into the sky, seeking refuge, perhaps from the cold? But their pleas would not be answered. Though it had ceased snowing, for the moment at least, the weather could hardly be called warm. The sun outside shone weakly, but it was a rather poor effort. I don't think I've ever seen such a melancholy sun before, so fragile, so delicate, and so tiny, too. It might as well have been a pinprick, a pinhead, a baby's fingernail. I shifted, strangely anxious. For a few moments I feared I really was at the bottom of a well. Even the playful winds had abated. It was quite enough to be eerie. I think that was quiet enough to be eerie. I could hear the sound of my own heart beating. In the still silence, frozen like a photograph, there was nothing to distract me from myself. I scrambled to my feet. All of a sudden I felt anxious, though I wasn't sure why. Worry weighted down my subconscious, but it was a nebulous and vague kind of worry I couldn't explain. Because I couldn't discern the source of my anxiety, I wasn't sure how to go about placating it, and that troubled me all the more. It was better then to move. I couldn't stay in my room any longer. If I did, I might have gone mad. I crept along the wooden corridor as quietly as I could. It was still relatively early in the morning, and I didn't want to disturb any of the guests. Not that I had seen any other guests. I presumed there must have been other guests, though, or Riku would not have looked so put out that morning. Put upon? Put upon. While I'd been laying on my futon, luxuriating in what little heat it afforded me, had Riku already been up and about, sweeping floors and conveying messages to the cook and jumping at the sound of her mother's authoritarian tones? Not for the first time, I felt sorry for the girl. It was unfortunate my pity had very few practical applications. I kept quiet, my head bent, and continued to pick my way down the hallway. No matter how silently I attempted to tread, the floor creaked all the same, announcing my presence to whoever cared to listen. But there was nobody around to listen. If there were other guests, they were tucked away in their rooms, still fast asleep. It was so quiet, save for the sounds of myself and my own shuffling. I could almost bring myself to believe I was the only person left alive. The only one in the whole world. There were no other guests at the Azami Inn. Why would there be? If there were guests, they wouldn't be flesh and blood humans. You'd have to be crazy to come to a secluded place like this of your own accord. No, there were no humans here, only ghosts. Maybe when I was sleeping, those ghosts crept out of the shadows and held parties. They would tell stories, the good old days, and play the koto, and let the sake flow. What else was there to do in these mountains, even for ghosts? If they were helpful spinsters or helpless romantics, they wouldn't find their second halves here. If they were downtrodden servants or lonely proprietors of decades past, they wouldn't find comfort here. If they were warlords or samurai seeking revenge against their defeated kinsmen, they wouldn't find salvation here. It was far too desolate. While conjuring up these stories inside my head, I failed to realize I had managed to stumble across a prominent figure of the inn's current state. That is, until said figure in question cleared her throat and gave me a curious look. Mr. Tanabe? Excuse me, Mr. Tanabe? Oh. I started, blinking away the hazy ghosts from yesteryear that had settled behind my eyes like the snow. The helpless romantics dissolved in fits of tears, and the downtrodden servants bowed themselves into non-existence, and the shamed samurai skulked away into the shadows. There was nobody left in the Azami Inn. Nobody save for myself and my hostess, Miss Kakayuchi Keo. I apologize, I said hastily, bowing my head. I didn't mean to ignore you. I was just lost in my own world, I suppose. It's quite all right, said Miss Kakayuchi, though I had my doubts. I didn't take Miss Kakayuchi for the kind of woman who appreciated being ignored. I don't think anybody enjoys being ignored. How else can we confirm our own existences if not with the eyes of others? But Miss Kakayuchi seemed to have less patience with it than most. I just wanted to ask, Miss Kakayuchi continued, her voice smooth and soft, whether you had a pleasant night. It was fine, thank you, I responded in turn, just as she had expected, polite, yet distanced. We could have been two birds passing by on opposing migratory paths, one going north and one going south, never to see the other again. That's what most human relationships boil down to. All the snow must have made me solipsitic? I have no idea what that word means either. Or maybe it was the cold. I hope the wind did not keep you awake, Miss Kakayuchi asked. It took a bit of getting used to, I said carefully, but I was able to settle down in the end. There are different noises everywhere you go. Tokyo can be loud at night, too. I can imagine, said Miss Kakayuchi with the air of one who did not care to imagine at all. Do you have any plans? I thought I might go for a walk. There is little else to do here, and the forest looks so very pretty. Like something from a fairy tale. It is pretty, Miss Kakayuchi agreed, but you have to be careful. I wouldn't want you to wander off and get lost. It would be bad for your business? Losing a guest would not set us in great esteem. No. She didn't even smile at my joke. I was sure Riku would have. Go for a walk, by all means, but don't venture too far into the forest. There should be some signs that point to Higashikawa. That's the nearest village. If you keep sight of those signs, you should be fine. All right, thank you. It's no problem, said Miss Kakayuchi, and of course it wasn't. She was just doing her job. She wasn't telling me to be careful just because she liked me. She hardly knew me, and I didn't think my first impressions had been all that favorable. Just as I didn't particularly like Miss Kakayuchi, I got the feeling that she didn't particularly like me either. I'm not sure why I thought that. Call it paranoia, if you will. But the way Miss Kakayuchi surveyed me, her eyes narrowed, left me with no doubts we were not and never could be friends. Just try to come back before 12. You don't want to, of course. You don't have to, of course, but if you want to eat lunch in the inn, that would be advisable. There aren't many restaurants around here unless you're prepared to walk in the snow for miles or hire a taxi. I bowed my head, thanked her again, and then I left. I had no desire to look back. The crisp air, chilled from the snow that had fallen last night, danced across the tip of my tongue. It was soothing and set me at ease, perhaps perversely, given it was so frigid. If it had been cold inside the inn, that was nothing compared to the temperature outside of its old wooden walls. The air felt cold enough to preserve a corpse, leaving it in an impeccable, pristine condition like a doll freshly unwrapped from a box filled with tissue paper. Miss Kakeuchi, however, was even colder. I was content to presume that Miss Kakeuchi's blood was warm and red like mine, but there was something about her that unsettled me. Riku, meanwhile, had to live with the woman. The poor girl had my condolences. As I walked, following the wooden signs Miss Kakeuchi had pointed out to me, the snow crunched beneath the soles of my shoes. When I glanced behind me at the winding path I had taken through the forest, I could see a long line of footprints. They were only blemishes on the otherwise flawless canvas. I felt a little sad that my presence had disturbed the environment so. I wasn't worth it. The snow, though ephemeral, seemed to have far more value than I did. It was prettier, at any rate, and probably brought people more joy. Most of my poems, my novel included, were rather gloomy works. Critics had panned my novel particularly, claiming it was rather too maudlin and not realistically so. Perhaps that was because I was writing from a position of privilege. I could write about sadness. How could I write about sadness, true, deep, untapped sadness, when I'd lived a comfortable life, accompanied by a loving wife and 2 devoted sons? I'd never before experienced great loss, or grief, or sorrow. Just boredom. And I had the nerve to tire of Sachiko's presence, simply because I had grown accustomed to the taste of her miso soup. When I looked at it like that, I was a horrible human being. Did I even deserve to have a wife like Sachiko? Sachiko had never wronged me, and yet, at the same time, I found I could no longer stand to be in the same room as her. Sachiko's servility, which had once seemed so charming, was now nothing more than an irritant. It was almost as though my vile thoughts were staining the snow rather than my feet. I felt, as I walked, that my existence was making the world a worse place. Perhaps it would have been better if I simply slipped away like the melting snow. However, I was too old for such flights of fancy, and I knew I couldn't be so irresponsible. Sachiko was waiting for me, and so were Kenta and Kenji. I had formed too many connections during my life, and I couldn't afford to sever them over a few childish impulses. Starting a new life? How could I? Out here? It sounded like a romantic prospect, but I would soon grow sick and tired of the snow. Just as I had grown sick and tired of Sachiko. Sachiko and her miso soup, which was so predictably delicious it was almost irritating. I laughed wryly to myself. How lucky I was that this was all I had to be upset about. It was almost like my life was too perfect. I wondered what Miku would make of my book. Perhaps she would like it. Women seemed to favor my writing more than men, perhaps because I had a fondness for penning romance stories. Mawkish romance stories. Where nothing right and everything fell apart. Nothing went right. My novel was about a young girl apprenticed to be a geisha. Of course, I myself had never been apprenticed as a geisha. I'm not a woman. Maybe that was why my book didn't sound sincere. I had no idea what I was doing, really. It was just fascinating, just fantasizing. But Sachiko liked it. Then again, Sachiko liked everything I did. I didn't know if I could trust her opinion. I paused at another wooden sign. Apparently, Higashikawa was 10 miles away. The wooden sign was a useful landmark amidst the sea of mirror maze repetitions. Out here in the strangely silent forest, the trees seemed endless. They formed a truly dizzying collection of brown trunks with icy boughs. No trees here would bear fruit. They were frozen. A robin twittered overhead. The delicate figure of the bird hopped amongst the branches, its head tilted to one side. Its colorful feathers seemed to glow against the snow, a splash of orange against the white. My walk brought some much-needed color to my face. My cheeks were flushed with blood and my fingers were tingling pleasantly from the cold. I returned to my room at midday with the intention of secluding myself beneath the warmth of my katatsu, but... My plans had not accounted for an uninvited but not unwanted guest. Riku was kneeling in the corner of my room, my breakfast tray at her feet. I gathered that she had been in the process of clearing away my morning meal. A little late, wasn't it? But something had distracted her. It was a book. To be more precise, it was a book of poetry, a neat little anthology bound in leather. This would not have been too startling were it not for one critical point, or one crucial point. They were not just any poems. They were my poems. I wasn't the sort of person to travel with a book of my own poetry, I understand. That would be rather arrogant of me, and I have never been overly proud of my work, either. Some of the poems in this collection were a good 20 years old or more, and I felt my style had matured a lot since then. There were so many useless, unnecessary words in those earlier efforts, and if they were emotionally affecting, they were overly sentimental. In my opinion, poetry shouldn't try to bludgeon the reader over the head with unwieldy masses of words. Poems should use their words carefully, like tools. Each and every syllable should be selected to achieve an overall effect. You could liken it to a doctor performing a delicate operation. He shouldn't use unnecessary instruments or apply too much pressure. That isn't the sign of a good doctor. Novice writers, I think, mistake their large vocabulary for unequivocal genius and struggle to utilize as many grandiloquent terms like this, perhaps, and phrases as possible to prove their own superiority, not to benefit their reader's experience, but for the sake of their own bloated egotism. It's quite a tiring experience. Yes, it is. In any event, I hadn't packed that anthology of poetry myself. Sachiko had. I wasn't sure why she thought I wanted it. Maybe she thought it would help me with my writing, if I could reflect upon my past failures. Not that Sachiko would have called any of my works failures, even some of the more trite pieces. Returning to my room, cold and tired, to discover Riku pouring through my poems, however. This was an unexpected development. My mouth parted in a small circle of unabashed surprise. Some of my poems were rather personal, and I wasn't accomplished enough in my youth to be cryptic. I was too in love with myself to cut down the details. There were poems in there about my childhood and my parents, and the kite that I had when I was a young boy. There were poems about meeting Sachiko and viewing the cherry blossoms together in Ueno Park? Ueno Park? And the birth of our first son, Kenta. It was, in other words, an overview of my entire life. This little girl, whom I'd barely spoken to, now held my history in her hands. Whether she realized it or not, this gave her an immense amount of power. I think she must have understood the gravity of her crime in some part, because she looked abashed, and dropped the book as though it burnt. I'm sorry, she stuttered. I know I shouldn't have, but I was clearing away your breakfast things and then I saw this in your case, and I know it was wrong of me, but I was just so curious. It's alright, I don't mind, really. I understand completely if you want to file a complaint. I'll accept any kind of punishment. And then she broke off, blinking in surprise. Did you say you don't mind? Well, I coughed. I ran one hand through my hair. I suppose this is somewhat embarrassing. I'm not overly keen on that anthology. Oh, you're not? Riku asked, inclining her head to one side. Why are you carrying around a volume of poems you don't care for, then? It was a good question. My wife packed it. Oh, Riku said again. The syllable slipped from her lips as clear as stream water. Does your wife like poetry? Sachiko isn't too familiar with poetry. I think she likes this collection because she feels she has to. I'm not sure how much she understands. I winced, but that sounds rather pretentious. Well, Riku looked down at the tatami floor, suddenly shy. I know I'm rather young, and my opinion probably doesn't count for much, but I liked those poems. You did? Yes, well, I didn't finish all of them, but they were very pretty. So detailed, too. The detail is the worst thing. You can over-embellish. Well, maybe it was a bit too much at points, but I think that shows how passionate the writer is, yes. Said Riku, nodding as she came to a conclusion. That's it. They're very passionate. The writer really, painted a picture with their words. I could see everything so clearly. I was transfixed. Even the poem about the fireworks? Especially the poem about the fireworks. Riku's own irises seem to light up with bursts of pyrotechnic wonder. Goodness, I sighed, letting my head meet my hands. That poem is the worst of the bunch. Heh. Well, maybe you can't understand it because you're a man. It's a very romantic poem. Ah, yes, the poem about the fireworks. It was one of the first poems I had ever written. It had been popular when I published it in the local newspaper, and is perhaps one of my better-known works. For that reason, I hated it. Looking back on it, it seemed far too juvenile and immature. The imagery was labored, piled on with a shovel, and the theme of silence was integrated clumsily. A poem about silence would know better than to fill every single space for breath with unwieldy words. And as for the lovers leaning in to share their first kiss, well, it was Sachiko's favorite poem of mine too. She always said reading it made her happy. It helped her remember. I tried to tell Sachiko that my words were too labored and imperfect to be an accurate depiction of real events, but she didn't seem to care. Apparently, this overflowing of emotion added to the piece. It's a passionate poem, said Riko dreamily, fireworks still sparkling in her irises, but it's rather dignified at the same time. It's a passion that threatens to spill over as the couple's lips draw closer together. She sighed, breathless, and held one hand against her chest. I wish I could kiss somebody like that. But Mother would never allow it. I'll die without ever being kissed, and then maybe the people in Higashikawa will tell ghost stories about me. Seemed like quite a maudlin end for such a young girl. Maybe that was why Riku looked so troubled. I've never seen fireworks before, but that poem was so vivid it helped me imagine. Riku shifted, her face a little flushed from her sudden confession. Perhaps she was embarrassed. I felt a touch embarrassed on her behalf, but she didn't duck her head or try to hide behind her hands. I came to clear away your breakfast half an hour ago, but I got so taken in by these poems I forgot what I was supposed to be doing. It was the fireworks poem especially. Of course it was. It was always the fireworks poem. Perhaps it wasn't such a bad piece of work then if Riku rated it so highly, but the stubborn part of me didn't want to accept that. I'd written it years ago, surely I'd created finer work since. But did the quality of my craft matter when the general public preferred my older pieces? More imperfect in their construction, yes, but perhaps more emotionally charged because of their naivete? I wasn't really sure how to feel. I was pleased Riku enjoyed my poem, but at the same time, it was a bit unsatisfying. It isn't nice to think that you haven't progressed at all in your craft, in fact, may have gone backwards over 2 decades. 20 years. It's a long time. Too long, rather, to cling to youthful remembrances of first kisses stolen beneath the star-filled sky. I didn't know what to do with myself after I read the poem, Riku confessed. I just sat there thinking. I wet my lips with my tongue. All of a sudden, my throat felt rather dry. If you don't mind me asking, what did it make you think about exactly? Oh, all kinds of things, said Riku. I thought about festivals I'll never go to, and pretty clothes I'll never wear, and boys I'll never kiss. She smiled sheepishly. What am I saying? I must sound so selfish and uncultured, reading such a pretty poem and only thinking about myself. I bet there are deeper themes in there, and I'm too stupid to see them. The author would probably be mad at me. Oh no, I said, the author wouldn't be mad at you at all. In fact, it's quite the opposite. How can you be so certain? Do you know them? Quite intimately, in fact. You see, I paused for dramatic effect, amused by the theatricality of the whole thing. In that moment, I could have been a disciple of the kabuki theater. Riku stared at me expectantly, her hands clenched into fists. For a few moments, it seemed as though neither of us could breathe, but wasn't that foolish? I already knew the grand reveal, though Riku didn't. Not yet. Tanabe Iji, I said, gesturing to the front cover of my anthology. I'm not sure if I gave you my full name yesterday, but, well, I spread open my arms, a modest expression on my face. That's me. Oh. Riku looked at the cover of the book, then back at me. She stared. Then her lips fell open in that neat little ring, so perfectly formed, I half wanted to run a thread of cotton through it, and her cheeks flushed. It was remarkable, really, how red she could become when it was so cold inside. It was less cold, however, with another body to keep me company. Riku's mere presence seemed to make everything cozier. Then does that mean the one who wrote those poems was... That's right, I wrote them. Oh, but I hesitated to append, because Riku seemed to be on the verge of a breakdown. Some of these are rather old. I might as well be a different man now. Certainly nothing I'd written since the advent of fireworks had achieved such levels of popularity. Unfortunately, this attempt to placate Riku did not have the intended effect. Her eyes were wide open, pupils swimming about in the whites, and she opened and closed her mouth with juddering motions, like keys stuck on a typewriter. You? I can't believe it, she exclaimed, and then she bowed so deeply she almost knocked her forehead against the floor. And here I was, talking about the author's intentions and acting so high and mighty when you were the one that wrote it to begin with. I must have sounded so stupid. You didn't sound stupid. I'm flattered that you like my poem so much. It's touching. If only it had been a poem other than fireworks. But I said, maybe you can't understand. I can't believe I said that. Of course you understand. It's your poem. You know far more about it than I do. That isn't necessarily true. Hearing a new perspective is always refreshing. There's a chance I could be conveying themes even I didn't notice. And each piece of writing means something different to every person that reads it. We all have different experiences, and that helps us engage with text in different ways. But what if I read it wrong? There isn't a right or wrong way to read a poem, and I'm not a teacher. I'm not grading you on this. Please try to calm down. I paused. And you don't need to keep bowing either. I was hardly deserving of such a show of subjugation. I was only a writer, and not a particularly talented one either. That was what the critics said. When I saw Riku's face, however, so shy and flustered, the tips of her ears were turning pink. The words of the critics who said fireworks was overwrought and overrated Didn't seem to matter at all. Oh. Riku ceased in her incessant motions of reverence, which must have been making her dizzy, and blinked at me. I'm sorry, she whimpered, I feel like such a fool. Look, I should stop talking, probably forever. Everyone would be so much happier that way. I wouldn't. Well, what do you mean? I mean... I swallowed. What did I mean? I like hearing about your opinions. It's interesting. Oh, I see? But Riku didn't see. Not then, at least. I must admit, at that moment, neither did I. I knew that I liked her, but I didn't know quite how much I liked her, or how much I would come to like her. I wanted to tell Riku that I enjoyed her company, but all of a sudden I felt bashful and I couldn't get the words out. My thoughts danced about inside my head just like the snow that was beginning to fall beyond my window. At that moment, the falling snow looked especially pretty. I remember thinking to myself, maybe I should write a poem about it. I'd sworn off poetry for a while. I tried to tell myself because of some harsh contemporary criticism, but maybe for Riku. It might be worth pursuing. But there would be no fireworks this time. Just snow. Pure, white, endless snow. Interesting. Alright. Well, that's a more appropriate spot to end the episode. Thank you very much for joining me, and we'll see you in the next one.